Hi guys, in this intense debate, Islam reformist Javad goes head-to-head with Daniel Haqiqatjou, challenging traditional views on women's rights in Islam. Javad pushes for reform and questions the treatment of women. Stay tuned for a thought-provoking video you won't want to miss.
Do the Quran and Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam endorse patriarchal laws, meaning laws which give men authority over women and laws which restrict sexuality? Patriarchy and limitations on sexuality are obvious when reading the Quran and Hadith. Verse 4:3 says that men have the right to marry up to 4 wives, and they can also marry their slave girls. Nowhere are women given the same right to marry multiple husbands. Verse 4:11 says that sons are due twice the inheritance of daughters. Verse 2-82 says that 1 male witness is equal to 2 female witnesses. In verse 434, we read, men are authorities over women by right of what Allah has given one over the other and what men spend from their wealth. So righteous women are devoutly obedient, guarding in their husband's absence what Allah would have them guard. But those wives from whom you fear arrogance, advise them, forsake them, and strike them. But if they obey you, seek no means against them. So this verse clearly distinguishes different gender roles. Men are described as authorities, and men have a specific role of spending on their wives. The verse also gives the husband the legal right to spousal discipline. The verse does not give her the same right. Verse 2-28 reads, quote, wives have rights similar to their obligations according to what is recognized to be fair, and husbands have a degree over them, a daraja. So this is clearly not gender egalitarianism. This is patriarchy. We also find patriarchal dress codes imposed on women. In verse 33-59, women are instructed to make their outer garments hang low. In verse 24-31, Allah instructs women to not display their beauty and to draw their headscarves over their chests. There is no equivalent set of instructions for men. So in numerous verses, the Quran affirms patriarchy. In Surah 66:10, the Quran even describes the wives of the prophets Noah and Lot as being under them. The Quran also prescribes legal punishments for those who engage in illicit sex. Refer to verse 4:15 and verse 4:16. And verse 24:2, which prescribes lashing and confinement for fornicators. Also refer to the 80 or so verses of the Quran concerning the condemnation of homosexuality. Now, moving on to Hadith, we see many indications of patriarchal gender roles and restrictions on sexual behavior. The Prophet ﷺ had multiple wives. There's no record of any women of his time having multiple husbands. Numerous Hadith describe how women were involved with cooking, cleaning, and raising children. Meanwhile, men worked as merchants, farmers, and soldiers. There are authentic Hadith that condemn women's leadership and other Hadith that describe a man as the head of the household. Hadith also describe the implementation of the hudud punishments for illicit sexual behavior, including homosexuality. Now, liberal reformers like Javad want to deny the Hadith in order to rip the Quran from its lived context so that they can do a bunch of goofy gymnastics to somehow prove that the Quran is actually against patriarchy and against legal restrictions on sex. This is not hard to do because when you detach the Quran from the beliefs and norms of the Prophet ﷺ, you can stretch and distort the text to mean almost anything.
All right, so Islamic modernists, we affirm the ontological equality of women, and this is based on the Quran. The Quran endorses basic human equality since we all come, in the Quran it says that humankind comes from the same soul. And the most noble of you before God are the most piously righteous of you. So we're all equal. In fact, God has made you spouses from your own kind. And because it's from your own kind, the relationship should be one of affection and mercy, not domination or sexual exploitation. Unfortunately, the pre-modern Islamic tradition didn't go in that direction and said that the woman was not created of the same kind, but was actually created from the rib of man. In fact, was created from the worst, most crooked of the ribs. And because of that, this idea was used in the medieval period to stress women's status as a lesser creation and subject to male control. Women were considered inferior in almost every sense. This was an explanation for why women have unsteady morals, were unruly. This is why they were a fitna, harmful. They were deficient in intelligence, deficient in religion, and this was all backed up by hadiths that were generated. Eve was created wise, but was then made foolish. She was actually locked into perpetual immaturity. That's the view of women. Women are ungrateful. They are actually going to be the majority of the followers of the Antichrist. They're going to be the majority of the followers, the majority of the dwellers of hellfire. In other words, the pre-modern view was that women were ontologically inferior creatures. This is because they were created from the rib, and that's why you need to confine your woman. So a lot of neo-traditionalists today would like to argue for complementarianism, which is the view that husband and wife will have equal but different roles. This is actually a very modernist view. The pre-modern view was actually one of complete inferiority of women, and that was expressed by Ashraf Ali Tanvi, who was a major traditionalist scholar in South Asia. This is what he said: "Ladies, how can you be equal to men? You have been kept at the rear in virtually everything. Men are superior to women in respect to their natural capabilities, in their intelligence, bravery, power, intellectual capabilities, strategic planning, etc. Man is the leader and woman is the subject. It is safest for a woman to be subjected and obedient to a man." So this is the view of the pre-modern tradition, which can only be called misogynistic, and led to the complete objectification of women. Let's take a look at that now. Daniel in his book, and he always is talking about secular liberal societies, how they objectify women and commodify sex, and how you can only have safe sex in marriage and through a marriage contract. I actually agree with him on this, but this is actually a very modernist take. It's the modernists who say that any sexual intercourse requires a marriage contract, and sex outside of marriage is not permissible. Meanwhile, the pre-modern medieval Islamic sexual ethics was that you can have sex with whoever you want outside of marriage, primarily and extramarital. That is with sex slaves. You can have as many sex slaves as you want. You can have an entire harem of sex slaves, thousands of them. There was in fact sex markets where you could go purchase girls and women and even boys and eunuchs. We'll talk about that shortly. In fact, the entire institution of marriage was influenced by the institution of concubinage. The parallel between wife and slave was simply assumed. A man owns both his wife and his slave. In fact, the marriage contract was a sale. It was a sale of the wife's vagina or bud, or which is also vulva actually. And this sale basically allowed the husband basic control over a wife's sexuality and physical mobility in the same way that a master has control over a slave's mobility and sexuality. And this led to the complete objectification of women. Now, Daniel talks about the commodification of sex. He's worried about Netflix and Tinder and all this kind of stuff, and I agree with him. But then how come he isn't bothered by this sexualization and objectification of women? Here's Ibn Umar, who is the Prophet's companion, who would put his hand between the breasts and buttocks of a slave girl before he was purchasing them. And this is a chain that's authenticated by Sheikh al-Albani. And he would shake the breasts of this woman. And when he would explain himself, he would say, "She is but an item for sale." In fact, the idea of examining the goods before you buy them, this was widely accepted by Islamic jurists, who said that this verse about covering up modestly, 3359, was actually only for free women. It wasn't for slave girls. In fact, slave girls were not allowed to cover up. This was forbidden because for slave girls, the aura, or the amount to cover, was just between the navel and the knees, and the breasts could be uncovered. In fact, as Jonathan Brown writes in his book, buyers at slave markets could press on the buttocks and breasts of potential slave girls, no problem. And the Islamic jurists justified this. They were okay with the sex slave trade. They were okay with sex slave markets. And you see here that I had to edit out these pictures. These women were just completely uncovered. This is the sexual ethics that he's trying to back up. He talks about family and having kids and all this kind of stuff. But here you have the medieval scholars. Here's Imam Ghazali saying, yeah, you can have coitus interruptus with your slave girl, that is, ejaculate outside of her, so that she doesn't dare get pregnant. So this, of course, had a corrosive effect on family life. In fact, it destroyed married and family life. In fact, sultans even ceased to contract legal marriages. Why would they do that when they could just have harems full of slave girls, hundreds, thousands of them, who actually, they couldn't have sex with all of them, so this forced many of them to, they were like going into adultery and have homosexual affairs. Here's Mehdi Tijani, who's Daniel's buddy, who says himself that he wouldn't have wives. If he could, he would just have concubines. And you know what? That's what the sultans did. They had 700 female slaves, they had 4,000 sex slaves, and they even had 8,000 young boys. We'll talk about that shortly. But this all makes the Playboy's mansion quite mild in comparison. In fact, we're talking about Saudi Arabia. Ibn Saud, the founder of modern-day Saudi Arabia, which propagates the ideology that Daniel follows, which, by the way, was backed by the British, he owned 3,000 people, and he distributed slave girls to his close collaborators. This is what Daniel follows. You can look at this disturbing documentary that shows a slave market in 1964 in Saudi Arabia. Here are some pictures again. Look how they're uncovered. This is the ethics he's talking about. One harm led to another. They actually had to, if you had a harem full of sex girls, then you needed eunuchs to guard them. Eunuchs were people who were forcibly castrated. Their balls were cut off or their penis was removed. And they would guard the cage, the harem, full of slave girls. Now, the jurists didn't allow the Muslims to actually do the castration, but they had no problem with importing them or having non-Muslims do that, so that it was actually widespread in pre-modern Islamic societies. Another evil that was prevalent was pederasty. Daniel tried to deny this in the debate with Inspiring Philosophy, but what Islamic scholars forbade was simply the actual act of anal intercourse. They didn't have a problem with pederasty in general. In fact, they said that writing pederastic love poetry was perfectly okay. Daniel has a problem with Western media when it talks when it has Miley Cyrus and the sexualization of young girls, etc. And I have a problem with that too. But then surely Daniel should have a problem with his medieval scholars like Ibn Hajar al-Haythami arguing that pederastic love poetry is okay. In fact, this was completely normalized. Images of an adult male pining for a teenage boy and begging for a rendezvous or a kiss did not arouse disgust at this time, and this was widely accepted. In fact, this major Hanbali scholar said there was nothing reprehensible in loving a boy chastely. There was this idea of chaste love of young boys. In fact, there was an entire genre of man-boy love, chaste martyr, which you would become a shaheed for this love if you died for that. Pederasty was in fact widespread in pre-modern Islamic societies because of this normalization by our Islamic scholars. And it was only in the modern period, actually it's in the modern period that Western visitors came and were horrified by this widespread pederasty in pre-modern Islamic societies. And it was actually the Islamic modernists who actually were embarrassed by this and said, you know what, these Europeans, they're actually right. This goes against our religion. And so it's the case that the Islamic modernists are the ones who work to change the attitudes and change this normalization of normalizing pederasty. Should we oppose this just because the West is the one who brought up the critique? Surely not. In sum, pre-modern medieval Islamic sexual ethics allowed concubinage, sex slavery, and normalized eunuchs and pederasty, thereby destroying the concept of monogamous marriage or a stable family life. It's the Islamic modernists who argued for sex within the bounds of marriage and the requirement for a marriage contract even with your slave, who then became your slave wife. Here's the evidence from the Quran. It's clear as day, no textual acrobatics, as Daniel says. Verse 4:25, and whosoever amongst you has not the means to marry free believing women, then marry the believing young women among those whom your right hands possess. So wed them, give unto them their proper bride's wealth, as married, chaste women, not as fornicators or lovers. That's the end of Daniel's entire argument. And when they are married, then they become slave wives, of course. And the Quran condemns those who follow their lust and just have sex with concubines without that marriage contract. Here's another verse in Surah 24 that says, and marry those who are single among you, and marry the righteous among your male slaves or your female slaves. And let those who are unable to marry be chaste. It doesn't say go and have sex with a concubine. It says be chaste. And Daniel was making fun of chastity in his last debate. And as for those amongst the ones whom your right hand possess who seek a contract of marriage, contract with them if you know of any good in them. And compel not your female slaves into fornication if they desire to be chaste. And whosoever compels them, this is condemned. And Daniel says that it's okay to rape your slave. Muhammad Asad says the above verse reiterates the prohibition of concubinage by explicitly describing it as whoredom. Let's look at that verse, that word, bigha. It doesn't just mean literal prostitution, as unfortunately the medieval exegetes took it. Here's a narration which clearly shows that it's talking about any extramarital sex, zina. And we know that from the Quran itself because the word is used in reference to Mary being not unchaste, 1920 and 1928. And here's an Arabic dictionary that shows it doesn't mean literal prostitution. It means fornication and adultery. It's using whoredom in that general sense. The Quran says in verse 4:3, marry either a free person or marry from those amongst whom your right hands possess. Again, it's always take them in honest wedlock, desiring to be chaste in honest wedlock and not in fornication. This is repeated throughout the Quran. Give unto them their bride's wealth. Again, the same verse, not as fornicators or lovers. This is clear as day, no textual acrobatics. Daniel says that you can just compel, and he laughs at this, and that it's just like giving somebody a burger, forcing somebody to have sex is like forcing them to eat a burger. But the Quran says, and compel not your female slaves into fornication if they desire to be chaste. Here's Daniel having a big problem with, why can't we rape our sex slaves? It's a big problem for him.